Well, we're back. Thank you for providing the Danish and the coffee. That was good. Good break.
That was good.
Yeah. One of the things that I didn't mention is we're going to be going over these in detail, some of the things we've already talked about, but we really mean this. Donna and I are really good at slowing down and answering questions. So if you have any questions as board members, please feel free, to say something that you would like to talk about. Now, I'm going to go through initially prohibitions. It almost sounds like we're back in the 20s here, but things that are just not allowed that a board member can or can't do. And one of the things is you can't ignore or change the CC&Rs without at least a supermajority of votes to terminate it, to change it, to dissolve it, or dissolve an HOA. And that's a very, very difficult task to do because you need the vote of the owners. And whenever you have the vote of the owners involved, all of us that have been working on boards for many years realize how difficult it is to get your homeowners.
Impossible.
Almost impossible.
Almost impossible.
So
and some documents are very old and they're not very clear. So that's when you would need to check with your professional to find out what you can and cannot do.
Mm-hmm. And we said this in the first segment too, and that is really the only thing that the board does in terms of elections is they elect the officers of the board, but they're part as a homeowner, the election of board members, but that is again a major responsibility. Now there's one time when there could be a reason that the board would get involved in appointing a board member. For example, let's say someone is deceased, someone decides to move out,
They moved.
And you have a vacancy. The way the law reads now is that you can fill a position on the board by appointing from the board members voting, but it's only until the next regularly scheduled election. And that's really important. It used to be that you could fill the term. Like if they were elected for 3 years and it was in the first year, you could continue a person, but you cannot do that anymore. The law clearly states
it must be a valid owner.
It must be a valid owner, and it must be only until the next regularly scheduled election. One other thing that we want to talk about is the kind of the powers, the duties, the election of officers, and so forth. The board cannot, like in their bylaws, create what they think a good board member should have as qualifications. Okay, like for example, you need to be an accountant, you need to have 30 years of business training and so forth. That is prohibited. You cannot determine locally what you want as a board member. So all of you were elected because basically you're an owner. And we like to say things like owner in good standing, someone who's participates and so forth. So these are things that you cannot change. As a board member, you do not have the right to vote on them. A lot of things that you'll find is the term of office and so forth, and some other duties that might be specific to your particular HOA will be found in your bylaws. And the bylaws must be consistent with the NRS 116 and any other statutes that affect us. And that's pretty much the things that are prohibited.
And always act in good faith. If you don't know, ask. Nobody is expecting you to know everything. We've said that before, and I don't think we can make that point enough. Really and truly, I remember when I was first elected to the board, I went, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do? And I said, well, I guess I'll have my fellow board members who will help train me. Well, guess what? They didn't have any more training than I did. Yeah. So we started taking classes, and it's very important to be informed. Ask your manager. Depend on that manager. That manager has been licensed by the state of Nevada. If you have a question, and there are no stupid questions. I mean, I just know how intimidating it is when you first sit down in a board meeting for the very first time. Ask your professionals. Ask your landscaper. If you have trouble with a tree, get an arborist. Ask your accountant, whomever. I think we have somebody that has a question.
Well, we have a question from a board member.
Yeah, I've been in business for over 20 years, and I'm really aware of a good business judgment rule and how things are conducted in my corporation. What is all this stuff about good business judgment? I know what I'm doing.
That's an interesting question. Thank you, by the way, for asking that question. The business judgment rule really is very basically using good business practices and so forth. and we use it a lot in HOAs. And one of the things that, someone could be 40 years in the corporate world, but they don't know the specifics that deal with directly HOA law.
And it's very different.
Oh, it's very different.
Very, very different. It really is. And that's why you need to count on your manager and your professionals to help you get through it, especially in the beginning.
Yeah, it's really important to use the whole concept of business judgment, because one of the areas that can get them a little bit in conflict is, it's a term again we hear a lot, the conflict of interest of board members. You got to watch out. And I made a joke about a couple of them earlier where the board members had certain personal kind of prejudice and so forth. But in a conflict of interest, you really need not only to have a concern for a direct conflict of interest, but even the impression that you have sometime favored a certain group or a certain person.
A perfect example of that is if you have a landscaper that landscapes your common areas, do not hire that landscaper to work on your own yard. Even though that landscaper would probably charge you the same as he would anybody else, it just doesn't look good.
Yeah, and maybe they put a 1-gallon plant in where 5 was supposed to go, and just somebody comes along and picks that out and makes a big deal out of it. And you got to have clear justification. That's not something that you did, and you just don't want to allow people to have that kind of impression. One of the other ones that I always point out is like a lot of times our spouses are involved in the clubs and the groups and so forth, and we need to be really careful, because if they're involved and they think we're doing something to favor a club, that they would say, oh, well, yeah, because his wife is the president of the Aqua Club, the pool gets more priorities and they spend money all the time on the pool.
You just need to treat everybody equally, and you also need to treat every house in your association the way you would want to be treated.
Well, the clear way to say this is, yes, we talk about the business judgment rule. Yes, the HOA is a corporation, it's a business, but it's not your business. Even though you're on the board and you are responsible, it's not your business. I think we have another question, and please, let's do that.
Yes, as a board member, can I vote on renovating the pool when my wife is the Aqua Club president?
Oh, we talked about this, yeah. You really can, and I'm glad I brought that up then so that you could ask that question. The issue is this. When you have a relationship and it's kind of minor in a way, I mean, so what? They're an officer of a club or something, and they still need the equipment or whatever. It's basically at the board meeting, when you get to that vote, that you declare that right on, and you say it to, directly to the people. Hey, I know you all know, and I want to make sure everybody knows, my wife is the president of that club. And you know what? I feel, I don't have a direct conflict, but at the same time, I may not vote. So you have a choice. You have a choice whether you vote or you don't vote, but you really shouldn't be part of the discussion. You announce that you have a conflict of interest, and it's really important that you do that. We have another question.
Why can't I discuss what happens in the executive portion of our meeting with my neighbors?
Boy, I tell you, people's privacy is very, very important. What happens in the executive session happens between a homeowner and the board of directors. It's not for public information or public knowledge. I can give you a perfect example. We had a woman who lived in our community who's going through a divorce, and she didn't want the neighbors to know, and she hadn't paid her assessments because she lost her job. And she came to the board and asked if we could do some sort of payment plan. But she didn't want her neighbors to know what happened. And that's when you just don't say anything about, even to your husband or your wife, where they call it pillow talk. What happens in that executive board meeting stays in there. It doesn't go any farther.
Sometimes as board members, we have situations where we get a little bit of emotional, we get maybe even angry a little time at homeowners. And part of that is also not saying negative things about an individual homeowner. You might be really tempted to say, and you say something like, that jerk down the street, I can't believe it. He got plastic flowers out in front of his house, we find them, and he still has them there. Things like that you just cannot do. Those are things that are dealt with in the executive session, which are 100% private.
Yes.
So, all right, well, let's move on now. We do have a couple other things that are important with the directors and the officers that need to know. We already talked about the state of Nevada has NRS 116.
Yes.
We know how massive it is. We know how detailed it is. We know that it's probably one of the most extensive set of rules and regulations
And it
in
changes
the whole
every
United
2
States.
years.
But we have to try to follow. And the other thing I need to say, and in all honesty, it can be confusing. It really can be.
No, it is confusing.
It is confusing.
Not can, it is.
Yeah, and there's other things like the NRS 82, and there's other things that come in. When in doubt, get the professional involved. When in doubt, use the professional. It's very important. So if you have an NRS question or a CC&R question, one of the most important things that you need to do is, and I know this always bothers homeowners and board members equally, you have to pay for expert service. Okay, so you need to contact a lawyer, you need to get an interpretation, and often you need it in writing so you know exactly what is said. You know, Don, I hate to say this, but sometimes even lawyers are confusing.
They are confusing. And one thing, as new board members, you need to know is you are covered under your D&O insurance, Directors and Officers Insurance. And that's a policy that the association has to protect you and committees or anyone who's volunteering time. But you have to make sure that when you make a decision that you've checked with a professional so it doesn't, so your insurance will continue to cover you. You can't go off and do something that is not right.
No, absolutely true. And, you know, we also have to protect the community manager. They're a valuable asset. They're a tremendous resource. They're very knowledgeable. They're trained. They take courses and so forth. But don't ask them to make legal opinions. That's not their title. That's not their responsibility. And sometimes board members like to pressure the community manager to do things that are really out of their territory. It's not something that they were comfortable with, and they should not be doing it. And that's important where you use the professionals. The other thing is you can't delegate your responsibilities as a board member. You have, in many cases in an HOA, the ability to appoint committees. Committee members are excited to hear about being involved and learning things and helping the board do things. But you know, one of the things that's important to understand is that a committee member works at the pleasure of the board. Isn't that a great term in the law?
It is.
Pleasure of the board. I love that one.
But committees are very important. It gets people involved. It makes people feel like they are part of this decision, they're part of the community. You could have a landscape committee where they walk the community once a month and recommend improvements to the board or where a new plant should be planted. And it's fun. It's fun. It gets people together. It gets people getting to know each other.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say, when we say you can't delegate, the board must remember who's got the ultimate responsibility.
It's the board of directors.
They can make all the recommendations in the world, but they need to make the final decision. Oh, we have another question. Go right ahead. Thank you.
Hi. How do I get on a committee, and do I have to run like the board does in an election?
Okay, good question. Good question. No, when we said the committee members are appointed at the pleasure of the board, I love saying it again, the board decides, and many times they do this through a volunteer process. I know we do it in our community magazine where we're going to ask people, would you be interested? We have openings in this committee, you know, finance, if you have a special interest in it, if you have a special interest in building and grounds. Everybody has different committees. Communications, it could be all kinds of things.
Architectural Review Committee.
Architectural Review.
Which
Everybody has a different
fun.
set of skills. And you actually get appointed for a term, usually it's about 2 years, with the board members voting, and they appoint you, and you serve on a committee. And that's the easier way. You don't have to get elected.
No.
Thank God, you don't have to go through all that process of being elected by homeowners and you know, campaigning or anything else.
Right.
You just, many times it's basically comes down to if someone expresses an interest and really wants to work doing something, we usually appoint them and we use them.
But I can tell you what's important is when you have committee members and people are volunteering their time, make sure that you notice them in your newsletter, your community magazine, your website, whatever you have. People love to know that what they do is appreciated.
I think we're at a point where we can take another break.
Sounds good to me.
We'll take a short break, and we're going to come right back with, again, some more detailed information. But thank you again for paying attention. You're a great group. Thanks for asking those questions. That makes it much more meaningful for all of us. Thanks a lot.